UFOs, are they aliens, government secret projects, the imaginings of disturbed individuals, or just outright hoaxes? We're here to find out. Welcome to Jim Harold's UFO Encounters. Well, welcome to UFO Encounters. I'm Jim Harold. So glad to be with you once again. And looking forward, I always enjoy bringing back some of our best guests. And this gentleman has been a guest on the Paranormal Podcast, and we've enjoyed our discussions with him. And tonight, I'm sure, will be no exception. I'm talking, of course, about author and UFO researcher Noe Torres. Noe holds a master's degree in library science from the University of Texas at Austin. He has written 6 books and a motion picture screenplay. With UFO researcher Ruben Uriarte, he authored 2 books about famous UFO cases along the Texas-Mexico border. Mexico's Roswell, the Chihuahua UFO crash, and the other Roswell, UFO crash on the Texas-Mexico border. In 2010, he released Ultimate Guide to the Roswell UFO crash, available both in English and I believe in Spanish as well. And he's done much work. He is a state section director for the Mutual UFO Network, and he's been on the George Norrie Show, the Jeff Rense program, the Paranormal Podcast, UFO Hunters on History Channel, and he's just a great guy and a great author. His latest book is Fallen Angel, UFO Crash Near Laredo, Texas. Noe, welcome back. It's so good to talk to you again.
Yes, hello, Jim, and hello to all your listeners. I really appreciate you having me back on your show. Our past shows have been a tremendous experience for me as well, and we have a lot of interesting stuff to talk about tonight. Life is an adventure, and I'd like to tell you a little bit about our latest adventures in the world of ufology. Oh,
that's excellent. Well, why don't we start with this idea of fallen angel? The date of July 7th, 1948. Now, around that time, we think of something like the Roswell crash, but there was a pretty significant crash near Laredo, Texas. Tell us what happened on July 7th, 1948.
Well, this is a very interesting case that actually not many people know about. It has been written about since the 1960s, but UFO researchers have looked into it in the past, but there hasn't been a great amount of information disclosed about it. So actually, the first book that's been written about it is mine, which has just been released. As you mentioned, Fallen Angel. And the term Fallen Angel is actually reportedly a code word that has a term that has been used in the past by the U.S. military to signify that an unidentified flying object has crashed, and signaling the need to activate a crash retrieval team to that location. So people that have, as I've been going around speaking about the book, they want to know where the term comes from, and so that's it. But as you mentioned, the date is very interesting because we're talking about an event that occurred almost exactly 1 year after the famous Roswell, New Mexico UFO crash of July 1947. So about a year later, the literature that has been produced on this case, the documents that previous UFO researchers have looked at and so forth that have surfaced over the years indicate that about a year after the Roswell, New Mexico crash, that there was a chase across the skies of Texas by several military aircraft who were in pursuit of a 90-foot diameter silver disc.
Wow.
That was traveling at over 2,000 miles per hour and headed to the south. So it was quite a spectacular sounding pursuit there in the airs above the state here.
Why do you think this has not gotten certainly a craft going 2,000 miles an hour and the U.S. Air Force giving chase? I mean, that's pretty significant. Why hasn't it gotten, the level of attention of something like a Roswell?
Well, the The thing that makes the Roswell case probably the world's best-known UFO case and one of the most difficult to refute for the naysayers and skeptics is the fact that there have been more than 100 eyewitnesses to the goings-on in Roswell, New Mexico in July 1947 that have come forward and given sworn statements to what they saw. It's pretty hard to make all those eyewitness testimonies just go away and disappear. And people have come forward over the past couple of decades, people who served at the Roswell Army Airfield in 47 and so forth. So the preponderance of eyewitness testimony and other evidence surrounding Roswell 47 crash makes it really unique in the annals of UFO research. On the other hand, the crash near Laredo, Texas in 48, 1 year later, unfortunately, we don't have the level of eyewitness testimony, and we don't have as much evidentiary material to support the story. However, it is a very intriguing story, and what little information we have been able to piece together about it over the years. Leonard Stringfield, a pioneering UFO researcher, worked on this case. Todd Zeckel, another early UFO researcher, also looked at it. And a number of others have looked at it over the years and pieced together fragments of evidence about it. And so it comes to us without the high level of evidence and eyewitness testimony that Roswell has, but nevertheless, it is one of the most incredible and intriguing cases that I myself have ever looked at.
Now, in terms of a crash, I mean, what are we talking about here? Are we talking about some type of shoot down? Was there what are the theories that caused whatever it was to crash?
Now, interestingly enough, as I'm sure you and probably many of your listeners are aware, in the 1950s, there was a policy for a while where the U.S. Air Force, the U.S. military, had put out a directive to actually engage and fire upon unidentified flying objects. Well, that policy didn't go very well because a lot of the aircraft that were engaging were also engaged upon with weapons that are obviously a lot more, technologically advanced than what we had at that time. And so that wasn't a good idea, as it turned out, and that policy was subsequently abandoned. But we were, of course, 1947-48 is a little bit early. We still had the Army was actually the air power in the U.S.
So it was the Army. It was still, I was wondering, is it was still the Army Air Corps at that point? They hadn't converted.
Yeah, it wasn't until late 48 and into 1949 that the transition was made.
When I said that, I was wondering. I hope I'm right because I knew it was right around that time.
Of course, it was nonetheless referred to as the Army Air Force at that time. So either way, even though it was prior to the split of the services, however, so this really wasn't the time yet when the engagement message was sent out to actually engage these UFOs. This was prior to that time, but still, there could have been there probably was no formal policy for how to handle these objects quite yet, because they really didn't start cropping up big time over the skies of our country until that time period of 47, 48. That's really when that massive wave of UFO sightings throughout our country that persisted throughout the remainder of the 40s and throughout most of the 50s and on into the 60s. That's when all of that started happening. So really, 48, when the Laredo crash is said to have happened, was very early in the history of our aviators encountering these strange objects and engaging them.
So I guess take us through the events. There was chase given. There was this craft or whatever it was going at 2,000 miles an hour. Then what happens after that? The crash and the aftermath of that crash.
Well, so the story goes that an unidentified flying object was picked up by a radar station in Washington State, and it was July 7th, 1948, and the object was inbound into the United States. And according to the information that's been uncovered by the previous UFO researchers that I mentioned, including Leonard Stringfield, William Steinman, who included the Laredo UFO crash in his book UFO Crash at Aztec, along with Wendell Stevens. So these pioneering UFO researchers indicated that that the object was picked up, as I said, by radar, and it was later picked up again, flying very rapidly over Albuquerque, New Mexico, where it executed a sharp turn to the south and eventually made its way into the state of Texas. Now, according to these researchers, the at least 2 military aircraft and possibly more picked up pursuit around the area of Albuquerque and headed on south into Texas. The object was described as a fast-moving metallic streak. Now, that's an exact quote from some of the eyewitness testimony that was reported. One witness said that the military airwaves were filled with chatter about an incredibly fast-moving airship headed their way. So anyway, this chase continued across the skies of New Mexico and on into Texas. And there are some accounts that claim that the jets actually fired on the object and may have been responsible, at least in part, for causing it to crash land later. And there was a very interesting article about this case that was written for Texas Monthly Magazine by Pamela Koloff some years ago. And she wrote, rumored to be a very large disk, it supposedly flew over Albuquerque at about 2,000 miles per hour before crashing. So at about 2:29 p.m. on July 7th, 1948, this object was moving very fast, but it had started to slow down by that time, about an hour after the initial sighting. And then, so the report goes, it began to wobble, and it started an erratic descent and disappeared from radar suddenly in the vicinity of Laredo, Texas, which is in southwest Texas, getting down close to the southern tip of Texas. And so somewhere near the Rio Grande River, about an estimated 30 to 40 miles southwest of Laredo, Texas, is where radio triangulation later established that the object must have gone down when it disappeared off the radar screens. So William Steinman and Wendell Stevens, in their book UFO Crash at Aztec, interestingly enough, they give some very specific data about from their sources about the crash location. And they said, and I'm quoting here, that the object crashed, quote, at a point near the Sabinas River, about 30 miles southwest of Laredo, Texas, in the Mexican state of Nuevo Leon on 7 July 1948. And they go on to add, this site was not far from the highway to Mexico City and near where the Rio Sabinas joins the Rio Salado before they empty into the Rio Grande. So it's very interesting because they pinpoint the location almost exactly. And in my book, I have a section of the map of Texas and northern Mexico for that area. And it's kind of a wasteland there. It's the beginning of the Sierra Madre Oriental, and it's kind of a barren area and very sparsely populated. And so anyway, as the story goes on, there was a crash retrieval team that was put into play from the U.S. And what's very intriguing is there were the reported finding of several bodies at the crash site supposedly by U.S. military who had been called out to that location. And there was a photographer who was dispatched from the White Sands Missile Test Center in New Mexico, who went down there and was given the task to photograph the remains of the craft and of the bodies. And he later gave testimony about or spoke to UFO researchers about what he had seen. And some of the descriptions of these beings that were recovered from the at the crash location are really, really bizarre.
Huh. So they actually, I mean, what amazes me, and to your point that this was horrendously underreported, is that all of this detail existed, but it has not come out until, more recent times. So what were some of these very strange details that you can share?
Yes. Apparently there was an attempt at kind of a preliminary autopsy that was held there actually at the crash site under tents by several military medical personnel. And the book UFO Crash at Aztec, which also includes a very large section on the Laredo crash, in that book the following statement is found. There was one body found within the craft. The photographers managed to get a series of pictures even though there was intense heat. When the object cooled down, the body was removed to a hillside and another series of pictures was taken. The body was said to be 4 feet 6 inches long, with a head extremely large compared to the rest of the torso. The eyes were gone and there were no visible ears, nose, or lips, with just a slit without teeth, and where teeth and a tongue should be, actually.
Wow.
The arms appeared longer than a human, and the hands had 4 claw-like appendages. Now, the description goes on to what I found fascinating about the case is this was before all the hubbub about a so-called alien autopsy in right. Roswell, and the film that most people think was a fake.
And the stereotype of the gray with the large head, I mean, that right. really hadn't come into play.
Yeah, because the source of these reports are from the mid-1970s originally, so this was way before all of that. And Steinman and Stevens in their book UFO Crash at Aztec say that the being's head was extremely large for the body size by human proportions. The eyes were gone from the fire, but the eye sockets were much larger than in humans and were almost wraparound, as if to give 180-degree vision. There were no visible ears or nose, but there were openings where ears and nostrils would have been in humans. There were no lips, and the mouth was just sort of a slit with no teeth or tongue. This parallels very closely the description that I read for you earlier from William McIntyre, who was another investigator into this case. So there were 2 legs of normal proportions with short feet having no discernible toes. But the part I want to skip to is the description of the attempted autopsy that was held, that was done by the military, because that is one of the most fascinating parts of this. There was apparently an attempt to autopsy the body there at the site. It said 2 Army doctors arrived at the crash site during the morning of July 8th, and they made a superficial, and that's in quotes, a superficial forensic examination of the body. As an anonymous Navy photographer snapped pictures of the procedure, he listened to the astonished doctors remarking about how the UFO occupant's anatomy differed from that of human beings. In addition to having no teeth or tongue, the creature's mouth was not connected by any visible canal or duct to any kind of digestive system. Also, the doctors could find no evidence of reproductive organs in the human sense. The examining doctors compared the body tissue, which was extremely smooth and gray in color, to the tissue of a human female breast. In addition, the doctors found no evidence of musculature in the body's extremities. In fact, they found no muscle fiber anywhere in the torso.
Wow.
They theorized that the creature relied on its highly complex bone structure to move its extremities, as opposed to relying on muscles as humans do. And now here's a very interesting part. The hands had 4 digits each, which were longer than human fingers, and the hands tapered to an almost claw-like appearance at the tip. To their amazement, the doctors discovered that the right arm had a metallic joint at the elbow. Also, there were no opposing digits like thumbs. Now, this is also incredibly fascinating. The entire abdomen was encased by a rib-like structure all the way to the hips. The legs terminated in a blunt stump with no toes evident. So upon further examination of the body, the doctors concluded that there was no evidence of hair or hair follicles anywhere on the body. They did find what looked like veins, but the fluid contained therein was colorless, with a slight green cast and a strong sulfurous odor.
Well, what's fascinating about that to me is so many times when we talk about something like the Roswell crash, there's always this excuse that there were bodies, but they were dummies. There have been even some claims by people like Annie Jacobson that the Roswell crash itself was actually little people that the Russians had genetically and the Germans had gotten together somehow and genetically engineered, and those were the people. That's a more recent theory that is in her book Area 51. What's amazing about this is the very alien nature of what you talk about, and if that description is true, I would say that it would relieve all doubt in my mind that there is something out there from someplace, another planet or something, because what you describe is incredibly non-human and unlike anything of this earth.
That's the sense one gets in reading these accounts of what transpired there southwest of Laredo in 1948. We get a strong sense of people who were amazed at and totally incredulous about what they were witnessing firsthand. It really comes across very strongly that they are witnessing something not of this earth. And this whole case was very intriguing to me. Of course, I first became engaged in it because of the fact that it occurred just a short distance from where I live. I live in South Texas and travel to Laredo quite frequently. And so that was an initial point of entry for me, of interest for me. But then as I read more and more and looked at all the sources on this, I find it almost as intriguing and engaging as the 1947 Roswell, New Mexico case. Now, here's an interesting little tidbit. If your listeners would do an internet search on Google, for example, for Tomato Man, the term Tomato Man, there were some photographs that turned up that were reportedly of the body that was recovered in this crash in Laredo in 1948. And the phrase that is used to describe what is in those pictures is this phrase Tomato Man, because the head of the being in those pictures looks sort of like a tomato. If your listeners will look that up, they'll run across several articles on the internet where that are reported to show what the pilot of this downed Laredo UFO supposedly looked like. Now, these photos, of course, have not really been authenticated, and there's been some significant challenges to their authenticity posed over the years. for all we know, they may not be authentic. We don't have conclusive authentication on them, but it's intriguing to look. And what you see in the picture matches quite closely to the descriptions that I was just reading moments ago. So, and I have those photographs in my book, by the way, Fallen Angel. So the whole concept that what really crashed near Laredo, Texas in 1948 was something that was obviously not of this earth. Is really mind jarring.
And it's interesting to me, the preponderance of activity just post-war. And there are a lot of different things to look at there surrounding the war and nuclear weapons and the ending of the war. Well, on one side you have the United States, who is in the middle of a burgeoning Cold War that's starting to generate with Soviet Russia. And then on the other hand, you have civilization and the human race that is starting to expand its wings in terms of its destructive capability with nuclear weapons. So often the question comes, was there more activity at this time because the, quote, ETs or aliens or whatever they were looking at us more closely because we were becoming more dangerous to ourselves or to the earth or to the universe? But certainly we were taking some strong steps that could be deemed as pretty aggressive.
That's exactly right. And now the composition of the crashed object in Laredo is another very interesting study for us. In the book, in the Steinman and Stevens book, the description of the object, the downed object, by witnesses who reportedly were at the scene, including this anonymous Navy photographer, stated that the object had supporting structures held together but by what appeared to be conventional bolts. But when the military mechanics attempted to unscrew them with wrenches, they would not turn at all. So they eventually had to be chiseled off. But the metal was extremely hard. The Army used carbide and diamond drills and diamond saws to disassemble some of the components. And it says that there appeared to be two kinds of metals involved. The first and most abundant could not be cut by the acetylene cutting torches that were brought in. The second immediately began burning the moment that the cutting torches were used on it. So there were apparently two different types of materials there. And then the account goes on. The structural skin of the craft was apparently blown away in the explosion when the device crashed. And the whole valley was littered with fragments of what appeared to be foil, very much like our cigarette packages, only much harder. You could not even bend the material. Before anyone could leave the site, MPs searched all of them and confiscated all fragments that had been collected. Now, here's another interesting little part. There was an absence of any wiring, rubber, glass, plastic, wood, or paper. The structures were bound by, as I mentioned earlier, what looked like bolts, but they could not be unscrewed with conventional tools. So it was an interesting kind of mix of materials. And one other interesting observation that was made by the Navy photographer that gave this testimony was that a metallurgist was brought in by the military to determine the alloy of the crashed disc. And after conducting his analysis, he said that the alloy had a honeycombed crystalline structure, unlike anything that he had ever seen before and anything that was known in Earth's technology. The metallurgist noted that the flying saucer construction might contain a form of silicon, thus accounting for its phenomenal hardness. So there are a lot of elements about this case, Jim, that are highly intriguing and that compare very closely with some of the other crash retrieval cases that Ruben Uriarte and I have been looking at in the Southwest.
And I'm assuming, I mean, based on the fact that this never came up, that there was more likely than not some kind of active government cover-up to keep this information from the American public.
Well, it's part of a game plan that's been run since the very first crash retrievals were made in the late 40s, Roswell included, where there apparently is an effort possibly to prevent panic or some kind of perceived threat to social stability, people's mental well-being or whatever. But there seems to be a concerted effort by unnamed governmental agencies to keep all of this under wraps and to not let it become page one headline story in everyone's local paper. There are interesting things that Ruben Uriarte and I have looked at in these cases that involve both the U.S. and Mexico, because they happen in close proximity to the two countries, is that word has leaked out through some Mexican sources as well as U.S. sources. And Mexico has traditionally and historically been more open to disclosing information about UFO encounters. And over the years, its government agencies and its military have disclosed encounters with UFOs by military pilots and so forth. So some of this information on the Laredo UFO crash and some of the other crash retrievals that we looked at really has come more from Mexican sources a lot of times, not just in the crash retrievals, but in UFO cases in general. In this area have come from Mexican sources.
In this particular case, was there a Mexican role in this crash and the aftermath?
Well, there had to have been, because of the fact that it occurred in Mexican territory, and there had to be some level of cooperation from the Mexican authorities. And I have a chapter in the book in Fallen Angel that specifically talks about Mexico's role in this. And in it, I point out that the Mexican president in 1948 was a gentleman by the name of Miguel Alemán Valdez, and whose term in office in Mexico as president, by the way, corresponded with that of Harry S. Truman, who was U.S. president from 1945 to 1953. Now, interestingly enough, Miguel Alemán, as he was known, Miguel Alemán and Harry Truman held talks in Mexico City in March 1947, and it was the first time an American president had ever officially visited the capital of Mexico. So the visit was a friendly one, and there were many discussions. Now, later, word leaked out that Miguel Alemán, during a visit that he had made to Washington, D.C., you can call it a reciprocal visit, some months later, he reportedly was shown and told some things regarding alleged crash retrieval events in the United States. And he later went back to Mexico and he told some folks that were within his inner circle in the Mexican government. And word leaked out later. It was picked up by a number of UFO researchers. Now, later on, here's the other interesting part of the story. Later on, Miguel Alemán had already left office as Mexico's president, and Dwight Eisenhower had become was now president of the United States in the 50s. And Eisenhower invited Alemán, former president of Mexico, to go on a tour. In 1982, Leonard Stringfield, who was one of the pioneering civilian UFO researchers really from the 60s, actually from the 50s all the way into the 80s. So Leonard issued a report saying that former President Miguel Alemán claimed to members of his inner circle that President Eisenhower had told him an amazing story about UFOs. Eisenhower claimed that he had visited an air base in the southwestern United States where he was shown a recovered flying saucer and its dead crew.
I think I've heard that story before.
Yeah. So this story was told at a gathering in Mexico in 1970, in which one of the guests was the former president, Miguel Alemán Valdez, who was the president of Mexico in 1947 when the Roswell incident happened, and in 1948 when the Laredo UFO crash allegedly took place. So it appears that on certain levels of government there was cooperation between the U.S. and Mexico with regard to the retrieval of downed objects near the U.S.-Mexico border, and we've seen that in other cases as well.
Now, everybody thinks that the Roswell case has been around forever in the sense of it being as well known as it is now, but it's my understanding that it didn't reach the pinnacle, until even as late as the 80s. And as time went on, it became more and more popular. I remember even as a small kid in the 70s watching things like In Search of. I believe you might have heard of Roswell, but it didn't take on this kind of everything, sucking all the oxygen out of the room for all the other cases. Now, so that begs the question, if you think about it, if something like this, through your book and through the publicity around your book and so forth, this too could rise to the area of a really well-known and significant case. Do you hold out hope that maybe that'll happen?
Well, actually, Jim, I would like to be optimistic about that, but it appears that because of the location, Roswell was a major military town in 1947. It was the site of the nation's primary nuclear strategic air wing. In fact, the world's only strategic nuclear air wing was based at the Roswell Army Airfield in 1947. And Roswell was a town of significant size. And so there were, when we say that hundreds of witnesses have come forward to having seen something out of the ordinary back in Roswell, New Mexico in 1947, the same, however, unfortunately is not true of the Laredo case because of the location. It was really not close to any major population centers. It happened in an area of Mexico that's very remote and hard to get to. And it was far enough removed from Laredo, which was the nearest large population center of any size. And the other thing that happened is it was the whole area was cordoned off and tightly controlled, apparently fairly quickly by the military. And so, plus the fact, Jim, that we're getting to a point now where it's becoming really hard to find any living witnesses to events that occurred during this time period. Roswell, which happened the year before this, there are very few witnesses left eyewitnesses to the events at Roswell in 47 who are still living. Those who are living are in their mid to late 80s, early 90s. So.
Yeah, because I mean, if you're 20 years old in 1947, for example, that means you were born in 1927, which makes you about 84 years old. So, yeah, I mean, and that's the importance of getting as much data on these cases as you possibly can, because once it goes, it's gone.
So people always ask me, so then, why have people waited their entire lives to say anything about this? Well, we don't have much of a concept today in our modern world of what military service was like in the 40s, 50s, and even into the 60s. There was this rigid, now we have this all volunteer army, military, and we've got there's a lot of loosening of restrictions on things, although the very highly classified stuff remains classified and remains tightly controlled. But there's a general kind of a feeling that the military is a lot looser now in its restrictions. But back in the 40s or 50s, the folks that I've talked to that were eyewitnesses to the Roswell UFO crash and other similar events back in that time period, 40s and 50s, they received very specific threats from military intelligence and from their superiors in whatever branch of service they were in. They were explicitly told, you will not talk about what you saw or these certain things. Sometimes the consequences were intimated at, and sometimes they were specifically specified. In some cases, with a person's life being on the line, even, was a suggestion.
And I think the general attitude, kind of what you spoke to in terms of the idea of, you know, you did what you were told. And if your leaders in a country, this was obviously before Vietnam, before Watergate, before the Kennedy assassination, when people were just coming out of the Second World War and they tended to trust their leaders, they tended to trust their government. Now, I know that people have never trusted politicians and leaders totally, but I think there was much more of that there. And it was almost probably, in addition to any threats, whether they were specific or implied, also a matter of patriotism. You know, our leaders say that this shouldn't be, because you have to remember, 1947, 1948, you're 2 or 3 years removed from the war. You're only, 6 or 7 years removed from Pearl Harbor. And, people have all kinds of things running through their mind. Are the Russians trying to sneak attack us? They probably weren't, some of these people weren't thinking about UFOs per se, or, I think some of it was probably laid at the doorstep also at patriotism and this kind of, mentality or zeitgeist of the time. The zeitgeist was when your leaders tell you to do something, you listen to them.
It was a reality of the time, of that time period. The patriotism, as you say, angled the tensions of the Cold War. The fact that we knew that the Soviets were stockpiling, nuclear weapons. We didn't know exactly how many they had or whether they would use them. It was a whole different era. There was a lot of tension, and American society had to have a certain level of trust in its military leadership and military capabilities. And anything that was labeled or branded as being a state secret or being classified or a matter of national security was generally very highly respected by the citizenry of that time. So UFO secrets being lumped into that whole national security, they just kind of stayed in that area. Now, the Cold War persisted through the 50s, 60s, and on into the 70s even. So that's a long period of time for us to be kind of in information shutdown mode and being very protective and secretive of certain military secrets and certain information and data that had been gathered over the years. And even though some other countries, such as the UK and a number of other countries, have come forward with some of their previously classified UFO secret documents, the U.S. has yet to make that kind of a disclosure to any great extent. And we don't know what the future holds, but we do feel, UFO researchers as a whole feel, that there must be additional documentary evidence in the classified and secret files that our government has been collecting since the first major waves of UFO sightings in the late 40s up to today. We've seen little bits and pieces of information come out, but we're not seeing the core of the documents and the photographs and the pieces of debris that have been collected at UFO encounter sites. That we're hoping might someday come, but until now, for whatever reason, it remains a very closely guarded secret, probably above most all others in our country.
Now, I want to talk a little bit about this UFO conference that you have coming up. But first, any final thoughts on Fallen Angel before we start talking a little bit about this conference?
An intriguing UFO case that lacks quite a bit yet in terms of substantiating evidence and eyewitness testimony. But as in some of the other cases that we've worked on, I think getting something out there for people to read about and think about kind of outweighed the consideration of wishing that there was more evidence available. So I put this little book out to maybe encourage some people to think about this, and maybe if there are any surviving witnesses, perhaps they will be more ready to come forward with that. This was actually going to be a section. This was originally intended to be a section in the book Mexico's Roswell, which Ruben Uriarte and I did back in 2006. So I had gathered all this information together on the Laredo crash of 1948, and we were going to kind of compare and contrast it with the Coyame UFO incident of 1974, which is what Mexico's Roswell is about. But however, Ruben and I were just finding so much information about the Coyame case that we finally ended up having to jettison the Laredo UFO story. We didn't want our book to be 400 or 500 pages long. So with the UFO conference in Laredo, the first of its kind here in South Texas coming up this year, I thought it would be neat to resurrect the material that I had been working on back in 2006 and kind of update it and put it together in the form of a short book. And so that's the conception of Fallen Angel. And people that where I've spoken to about this case have been really, really excited to hear about it. So I'm hopeful that perhaps that will lead to more information about this.
Well, certainly we respect the work that people do on the well-known cases, the Roswells and so forth. But I must say that I think it deserves particular note when you go out to cover a case that may not be as well-known as, quote, glamorous. So hats off to you and also the work that Ruben Uriarte do in looking at some of these cases that maybe some of us may not be as familiar with. Now, I do want to talk to you. You have an interesting conference coming up in southern Texas, and please tell us all about it, because I certainly think it'd be interesting for folks in particular in that part of the world to check out.
Well, it's funny how these things happen, Jim. Back in 2006, I mentioned a while ago, we were going to include a section on the Laredo UFO crash of 48 in our book Mexico's Roswell, which subsequently spawned several television documentaries, and UFO hunters came in and asked us to go down there and recreate our discovery of some of the artifacts from that incident. And so we did a show, Ruben and I did a show with UFO hunters, and then Ruben did UFO files also on the Coyame case. So all of this interest that was generated from Mexico's Roswell. And so this story got kind of put into the background. But what I did do was I took the work that I had been doing on the Laredo section of the book and I turned it into an article for Wikipedia, the online encyclopedia that I'm sure everyone's familiar with. But so if you do a search on Wikipedia for Laredo UFO crash, you'll see the article that I wrote, that I began writing in 2006, which basically it kind of boils down the whole case into a nutshell. So now, the interesting thing is that folks in Laredo with the Laredo Paranormal Society. It's a group of paranormal and UFO investigators in Laredo, Texas, and also folks from the Webb County Heritage Foundation who do a lot with legends and folk tales and stories that are unique to the Texas-Mexico border. They kind of combined forces. They ran across my article on the Laredo crash, and so they came up. That was part of the impetus for trying to have a UFO-themed conference in the city of Laredo for the first time ever that anyone can remember.
Right.
So they scheduled this major one-day UFO conference, which is being held on Saturday, November 5th. That's just about a month from now. Saturday, November 5th in Laredo, Texas, at Texas A&M International University in Laredo. Very nice campus there in one of their amphitheaters. And I'm going to be presenting evidence on this 1948 Laredo crash. But the featured speaker, and the one that I'm really eager to hear again, I've listened to his presentation at other conferences, is Travis Walton, the famous of the famous UFO abduction case, which is probably the world's best known abduction case, will be the featured speaker at the Laredo event. So we're hoping that this is going to become a major South Texas venue for UFO information, and we hope that it will grow into an annual event. And so far, it's being sponsored by the Webb County Heritage Foundation, a nonprofit group in Laredo, and they're being backed by as I mentioned, by the Laredo Paranormal Society. And so far, they've told me that the interest for this event has just been incredible, mind-boggling, and they're having trouble keeping tickets in hand for this, because everybody is inquiring and purchasing tickets to this event. So we're hopeful, as I said, Jim, that we need more events of this kind and of this magnitude in this area of the state of Texas, and really throughout the state of Texas. We haven't had, interest has over the years not been where it should be in terms of UFO research here.
Right. And if folks, where can folks go if they want more information on that conference?
Well, the easiest thing is to go to our website, which is roswellbooks.com. And there's a link there to information about the Laredo event, and also folks who might want to attend who live in that area or might be traveling in the area. There's a link for purchasing admission tickets online as well. Laredo is one of the nice, quaint, very, very nice people, very friendly communities along the Texas-Mexico border. And we're looking forward to having a really great time down there. And I know every time I hear Travis Walton speak, whose story, by the way, as most of your listeners probably know, was the basis for the very popular movie called Fire in the Sky from a few years back.
Yes, of course.
So we're looking forward to hearing Travis speak as well. His account is just riveting of the time that was spent being led around by these strange beings after he was abducted back in the 70s.
That is a fascinating story, as was this Laredo crash. And Noe, I thank you very much for coming on UFO Encounters and sharing it with us again. And your website again is roswellbooks.com, is that correct?
roswellbooks.com, yes. I've got links there to a lot of information about the cases we've talked about tonight, and there are video clips and audio testimony from witnesses and so forth. And there's links also for how to purchase our books if people are interested in that. We've got links to the Amazon booksellers, and our books are also available for the Kindle as well.
Well, we'll certainly have links at jimharold.net. And once again, We thank you so much for coming on the show, and we look forward to talking to you again, not in the too distant future.
Thank you so much, Jim, and have a great rest of the show.
And thank you so much for tuning in. We do appreciate it. We will catch you next time. Keep your eyes to the skies. We'll talk to you on UFO Encounters. Good night. Bye-bye.